session. Some of you guys made it to our speaker session this morning, and that was really great. So thanks for showing up. And the recording of that will be up tomorrow. We'll email it out to you guys and we'll post it on the website. So we're going to start off by doing a few introductions of the people here. So I'll start. I'm Angela Yang. I'm currently editor-in-chief of the FREEP, and I was city editor last semester.
Hi, I'm Haley Lerner. I'm currently chairman of the board of directors of the Daily Free Press. I was previously editor-in-chief and city editor too.
Hi, I'm Sarah Radine. I'm a former features editor and current managing editor of the FREEP.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Kelson. I'm the current city editor at the FREEP.
Hi, I'm Cameron Morrisberger, and I am the features editor at the FREEP.
All right, so to start off, we're gonna introduce you guys to a little bit about the FREEP. Haley, are you able to share the slideshow? Sorry, we had a little technical difficulty earlier when my sound wasn't working, so everything got screwed up, but we're trying to figure it out. Also, can everyone type into the chat where they're from? Okay, cool. So we have California and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yeah. Texas, Florida, LA, Atlanta. We have one person from Venezuela. It's pretty cool. One from Pennsylvania.
Okay, now we can officially begin. Sorry about that. We weren't really sure to do this because Angela's having tech issues, but now we're really ready to start. So welcome to the first workshop day of the Daily Free Press Summer Journalism Bootcamp. Thank you all for coming. We're very excited, and we're going to get into some basics of reporting. And as we go along, if you have any questions, you can drop them in the comments and we'll do a Q&A after each specific little subsection. But yeah, and if there's something you're like, oh, maybe they'll answer that, like maybe wait till the very end, but we're going to try to answer all your questions and go over some fun basics about journalism. So to begin, oh yeah, here, just to introduce you to the FREEP. This is our office. It's under an Insomnia Cookies in Boston on our campus at Boston University. It's really fun. Whether you go to BU, whether you're just at a college campus anywhere in the country or world, join your college newspaper. That's what all of us can definitely say for sure. And yeah, so more of our introduction. Yeah, we're a digital and print newspaper. Yeah, so we print once a week. Most of the time it's dependent if we get ads. So there's a whole business aspect to it, and that me as chairman, that's my big responsibility. I deal with our finances and the more boring stuff of the paper. But then we're on digital every day of the week during the school year. And even though it's summer right now because of COVID and everything going on, we've been updating our website almost as much as we do during the school year. So you should read our stuff. Our reporters are doing really incredible work.
Yeah, and every college newspaper this summer has been doing incredible stuff because it's just such a dramatic summer. Everything is happening. So definitely, whatever school you're going to, follow their coverage.
Yeah, and one of the things we're most proud of at the Daily Free Press is that we're independent. And you might not know exactly what this means because you might be like, oh, aren't all student newspapers independent? But the difference is we are not supported by our university financially at all. All of our financial funding comes from advertisers or donors, not the university, which means they have no control over what we do. Editorially, we have complete freedom, which means that we can call them out if they're doing something that people don't like, or we really have free reign on covering the university, unlike some other outlets on campus. Or so that's something interesting, like at your university you're going to like look into, is there an independent newspaper versus a non-independent one? A lot of schools only have one, and there isn't always an independent paper. We happen to be the only newspaper on campus and the only independent one, which is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. And some schools have a university outlet that's basically a newspaper or a news outlet, but it is affiliated and run by the university. So those are not necessarily independent. So if you want to truly hold your school administration accountable, we just believe that independent newspapers are the best way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of schools, there might not be an independent paper, or it might not be that established. And of course, always join your newspaper whatever way you can. And there's kind of varying degrees of independence. Some have no like input from professors, but they technically receive funding, and like they still could probably have some oversight. So just when you're applying to your student newspaper, like look into it, like just know what you're working for and kind of what you can do. Yeah. And another thing about us, it was our 50th anniversary this past spring, which is just so exciting. You might think, oh, we're not as old as some newspapers, especially considering BU's not a young university, but we were started after protests on campus, and kind of it's been our thing. We cover turmoil on campus, and 50 years is really awesome. We're proud of it and proud of kind of the newspaper we built over these past years.
And one really interesting parallel is that our first ever print issue, we actually covered BU closing its campus for the first time and sending everyone home. And so exactly 50 years later, pretty much, we were covering the same thing.
Yeah. People, like, I feel like you're gonna find out, like, when you go to your college newspaper, that we're big nerds about like old issues. It's try to like always get into your archives, your old papers. That's always fun. Like, it's crazy looking at stuff that's 50 years old, and you're like, people just like me were doing that 50 years ago. And we still have alums that are that old that come to us and are like, I love the free, like, it's cool. Okay, so now just an overview of what we're doing today. The first thing we're talking about is ethics of reporting, then what's newsworthy, finding story ideas, and the reporting process. So these are all really like basic level, what you need to know if you're gonna start doing college journalism. Not too complicated, and I apologize, my light's flashing in my room, but yeah, so let's kind of get started. No, that's, yeah, okay. So the ethics of reporting. Yeah.
So the Society of Professional Journalists has their code of ethics, which is basically a set of principles guiding the practice of journalism. And they're not really enforced as rules necessarily, but they're basically followed by journalists as standards. So let's go to the first one.
Yeah. Yeah, so the first is, seek truth and report it, which really means the point of journalism is to find the truth. Everything, honesty is like the number one thing. You never want to put anything out there that's false. And the whole purpose behind why you're reporting should always be about the truth. There shouldn't be ulterior motives. It should all be about the truth and reporting the truth.
Yeah, and never sacrifice veracity for speed. We know that it's really tempting to always want to be first, especially when something just breaks, but it's always better to be right than to be early. So just remember that you have to fact check and verify every single thing. Hear it for yourself from the source, not just report a rumor. And just a couple of things about what truth means. Truth isn't always just like black and white fact. It's also context, because context is crucial to painting an accurate picture of what actually has happened. So if you give attention to only one aspect of a story, then it's not the full story, and that erases the full truth, even if it's not intentional. And fairness is also another thing that plays into truth, because the objective truth itself doesn't favor any particular side. So context is kind of part of being fair, but basically when you criticize or when you report on like a group of people criticizing someone, for example, the administration, you would have to go to the group or person being criticized and ask them to share their side of the story so that at least they have a chance to have their perspective heard. Everyone deserves that chance.
Yeah, it's really important that no matter how much like you think one side might be totally in the wrong personally, whatever your personal beliefs are, you always have to lay them completely to the side. It's all about getting every possible person that matters in a story, getting their perspective. And that kind of goes along with minimizing harm. So this is basically the kind of tenet of whatever you do in your reporting, you don't want to cause more damage. The whole point of reporting is to seek truth, and if your reporting is going to cause more harm than good, then you might have to reevaluate why you're doing that reporting. You have to, so it's kind of a judgment call, honestly, a lot of times, but minimize harm means if you know someone, if they're going to be named in an article, it could, and they're not someone that did something like bad, like that they need to be held accountable for. If you know that person is going to lose their job by talking in an article, but they don't know it necessarily, but you know it, it's your responsibility as a journalist to kind of take other people's lives into consideration.
And something that it's important to remember is that private individuals differ from public figures. So obviously people who are in office or are a politician, they have to be held accountable. So it doesn't matter how much they don't like something or how much harm it could do to their reputation. If it's something that they did, then it's still your job to report it, because these people serve the public and they basically signed up to be held accountable. So the difference with private people, though, is that they didn't sign up for that and they deserve to have their rights respected. So I think one example of something that could harm a private individual is when you're photographing protesters at an event, for example. Obviously, legally, there's nothing wrong with photographing people's faces, and they basically are in a public space. Like, yeah, legally, there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, realize that these people in particular might be vulnerable, because we know that the Ferguson protesters have later on been doxxed and some have been found dead of non-natural causes. So if you know that harm can possibly come to someone based on what you're reporting, then it's always a good idea to think twice about whether or not something is really necessary to the story for you to report on.
Yeah, and if you're ever thinking about something and you're like, I have no idea what to do, like, do I have to make this judgment call alone? Always go to your editors. You're obviously not going to be working on your own. If you're doing reporting, you're always going to have an editor unless you become the editor. There's always someone to ask for help. If you're ever unsure about something like this, like, am I going to cause harm? Like, ask, like, because that's the last thing you want to do. The whole point of reporting is to shed light on things that, you know, people don't know about and help, you know what I mean? Like, show injustice. And if you're just, you don't want to add to that, basically. So just always talk to people, ask for advice.
Mm-hmm.
And the next, is act independently.
So, yeah, one more thing that I want to add to the minimize harm point. Sometimes if you don't really take that into consideration, like, one type of harm can also be to reputation. So that could open the door to legal trouble for the newspaper. Like, for example, when someone has been convicted or someone has been charged with murder, you still can't print that they murdered someone because they haven't been convicted. So just like things like that, that does go into legal trouble too. So just be careful about what you claim, and always ask your editor, of course, if you're unsure about something.
Do you guys see my screen right now?
Yeah, but
do you see the blue, or is that just me? Okay, how do I get out of there? Sorry guys, I'm not good at
try clicking start. I don't know. Wait, what happened?
I accidentally hit the Q&A. Maybe if I click off it. Yeah,
but if it doesn't work, we can just go on without the presentation.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Wait. Here we go.
Okay.
I was trying to like do a Q&A and confusing. Okay. There we go. We're back. Okay, so yeah, did we talk about, we didn't do act independently, right?
Mm-mm.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the next is act independently.
Right. So basically, there's a lot that kind of goes into this. Be transparent, first of all, about your potential conflicts of interest, and be conscious about separating them from your work. So, for example, don't write about an organization or a business, like, or an organization that you're in, or like a business that you work for, because obviously, even if you don't think that you'll be biased, it's still a conflict of interest. And even if you truly are not biased, it still does not look good to have you reporting on that. Also, don't cover a political candidate that you've campaigned for. Don't interview your friends or your colleagues. So basic things like that. But also a couple of tips. Decline any gifts that sources may offer you, because that could compromise your own objectivity. You never want to accept or pay anything. Like there's no transaction for an interview. So like, don't ever pay a source to interview them, for example, because that also could open the door to them exaggerating and creating a story just to like have some extravagant thing worth paying for. It's just really ethically dubious. So yeah, just remember, don't accept gifts, don't pay anyone for an interview.
Yeah, and another part of that is sometimes you're going to come across this kind of early on in your career, maybe, that people are going to be like, oh, after you interview, they'll be like, can you send me a copy of the story before you publish it? Or can you send me what quotes you're using of mine? You don't have to do that. Like, don't say no, it's against, I mean, I know specifically with the Freep, it's literally against our guidelines. I don't know what your newspaper has, but no, you don't owe anyone a copy of your story beforehand. If anything, it's, you really don't give one, because they can say, I don't want that anymore. And what they said on the record of the quote is what they gave you. They can't go back because they don't like the way you're writing it. So don't let anyone that isn't your editor have editorial oversight, especially your sources. That's just a big no-no. And
Yeah.
it might be confusing at first because they might phrase it in a way that's like, oh, look, I just want to make sure you like quoted me correctly. Don't. Just be like, well, I can read you, maybe read back a quote, the full, like, you know what it is, like, don't just let them judge your story.
Yeah, remember never to send them your draft, basically, or of anything before it's published. But there is one thing you can do, and that's verifying facts with them. Like, obviously, if they want to check if something is accurate or not, you can definitely tell them what facts you're publishing. That's not the same as sending them your story. So yeah, that is fine. It's just, there's kind of a fine line between sending them a story and just sending them the facts you plan to publish.
Yeah. And the last one is be accountable and be transparent. So
yeah. So obviously, always acknowledge when you've printed a falsehood by accident. Make a very visible correction stating what was false and what you changed about it. So it always builds more trust with your audience when you just come forward about an honest mistake rather than try to hide it. Like, if you just update the story without acknowledging that it was incorrect. Well, first of all, there were people who read the original story and believed the incorrect facts. But also, when you don't notify your audience, or you don't have to like notify, but like obviously make a clear correction. And if a source was misquoted or misrepresented in any way, you want to let them know when you've corrected it. But yeah, it also just is good to let people know when something is corrected, just so they know that it has been corrected. Yeah, and always identify yourself as a journalist when you're covering a story. That's part of being transparent. You, like, in the vast majority of cases, you never go undercover to cover a story. It's you are a reporter and you have your rights to go cover whatever you're covering. And also be clear about where your information came from. That's why we attribute our information to sources throughout the story, just so like it's part of being both accountable and transparent. Like, you're telling people where you got it from so they can know or they can think for themselves whether they want to trust that source or not. Yeah, and then I think I would say when you're publishing a controversial story, don't be afraid to explain your rationale behind what was published, like how you chose to publish it. Just be open to dialogue with your readers, and if they ever have any questions about your reporting or what they thought was misconstrued, always engage with them in that conversation and hear them out and be open to what their ideas might be.
And I guess kind of overall, like, why are ethics so important? Without ethics, your reporting isn't going to be good. You know what I mean? Like, first of all, in a time where people really doubt the truth of news, whether that's an accurate judgment or not, like, if you're not ethically okay, like, there's going to be so many other problems with your story, whether it be factually. You just need to follow ethical guidelines, or there's going to be some serious issues with your reporting. Your editors aren't going to be happy, and the people that you're reading aren't going to be happy. And not only are they not going to be happy, but they're going to feel like you wronged them, and you never want that. You never want to disservice the community that you're trying to cover.
And part of holding each other accountable, journalists and news outlets all over the world, we're so critical of each other when we make a mistake, because this is an industry that rises together and falls together. When one media outlet makes a huge mistake, it reflects really badly on the whole industry, on the whole field. So I also want to say that journalism and government are kind of paralleling each other in a way, because we are all public servants. I believe Vanessa was the one who said this. Like, we often work against each other, but in a way we share the same goal. Our goal is always to serve our community. So we have to make sure that at least we get this right. And of course, journalists are the keepers of democracy. So, I mean, our profession is literally woven into the fabric of our Constitution, and that's why it's so important that we keep on doing it right, because we can't afford to lose the trust of the public.
Yes, so before we move on to the next section, I'm gonna stop screen sharing and we're gonna answer some comments. I'm not sure if they've rolled in. I can't really look, so I'm gonna stop sharing and we can see if there are comments.
We have one question from the Q&A. It says, is there a fact checker online to check and verify the story? I think there's like a search engine where you can plug in facts and it'll tell you whether it's true or not. I don't think, like, truth isn't that black and white most of the time. Do you guys want to talk about how we fact check?
Yeah, so our fact, sorry, I'm trying to navigate this screen. So our fact checking process at the FREEP is honestly like very thorough. Honestly, it can be more thorough than I've noticed at internships at places I've been, mostly because I mean, the people working at internships and jobs are professionals, so they don't need to be as rigorously fact checked. But as student journalists, like, we fact check so hard. It kind of goes through a, say, 3 or 4 round process, basically. You know, we have writers send in their stories. They kind of give potentially some of their contacts. We make them send all transcriptions of their audio recordings of their conversations. I don't know what your newspaper's policies will be, but we have a very important policy of like, record every conversation interview you have. Of course, you have to ask permission, because in Massachusetts it's illegal to record without permission. But so it's all about like, we need those transcriptions because we need to make sure that people are telling the truth. They didn't make up interviews, because those things do happen when you have young writers that might be nervous. Not saying that any of you would do that. It's just happened. We have to be careful. So we do transcriptions. We check the quotes and everything in those transcriptions. And then every proper noun, we fact check for spelling, that it's a real thing. So names, places, all of that, we rigorously fact check, goes through multiple rounds, like associate editors, section editors, editor-in-chief and managing editor check fact checks. Like, we're that big on it. So there's no fact checker online, but if you're working for an outlet and you don't know if they fact check properly and you're worried about something being wrong, any fact in your story, any proper noun, just look it up yourself. You know, it's all pretty commonly available. If you don't know if a name is spelled right, that's like a random resident, check it on white pages. There's a lot of things you can just do just by searching facts and like double checking everything, I'd say.
Yeah, for people, the way we fact check, it depends on the type of person. If it's a student, BU, we have a student directory where we can just type in the name of the student and it shows whether they're actually a student or not. It shows you their email or whatever, but not all schools have that. So for that, we sometimes, when we fact check residents, if they don't show up on white pages, which is a online people finder, it basically is like yellow pages except white pages because internet. There are like multiple people finders out there. They basically show you like their name, which city they live in, their age. That's why when we get resident quotes, we ask for their name, age, and neighborhood in Boston so that we can check that they exist online. Sometimes they don't, but yeah, so we can also like find their LinkedIn, find their Facebook or any social media where you can verify that it's them. Also, if it's a source from like an expert from a company or a professor, then it's easy to just find their page as an employee at wherever they work at.
Okay, so the next question I have in here is if a private individual wants to remain anonymous, how can you be clear about your sources? So the policy that we do is someone should only really be an anonymous source if they have to be. Like, if let's say your editor tells you, hey, I want you to get 3 random residents, and then you talk to people and you get 2 people with names and 1 with an anonymous, that's not a reason for them to be anonymous just because they said, oh, I don't want my name. If they're not an essential part of the story, like a random person. Also, if it's just like a source that you really should only be using an anonymous source if it's for their protection, like by having them named, they will be put at risk. And that typically goes for things, I'd say, like any instances of sexual assault or serious allegations against someone that's of power. It's really a judgment call that you have to ask your editor for, but our main policy is like no anonymous sources unless it's really necessary. It's always anonymous sources are more of an exception than the rule, I'd say. The next question is, how many of these rules apply to opinion pieces? So yeah, I mean, obviously opinion stories are your opinion. You can be obviously not necessarily balanced because it's your opinion, but what matters is factual. Like when you're writing an opinion piece, you can't just make stuff up. And we fact check all of our opinion pieces, every single one, because people, like, just because it's your opinion doesn't mean you can't just say things with no basis. You can't just accuse people of being a certain way or something that needs like a factual backing behind it, if you know what I mean. So I would say most of these things do apply to opinion pieces. It's just a matter of, obviously, you put your own opinion in, but you should be following all ethical guidelines and use your own judgment if you're writing a column or something.
There's a good question in the chat. It says, what if you interview someone and they say a really good thing, but they use lots of filler words or like basically like they're not speaking clearly? Yeah, when we put in quotes, you don't have to write word for word. Like basically you don't have to put in the filler words, like when they say like or you know, those words are irrelevant to their point, and it also just makes the source look dumber than they are. Like if something takes away from the full context of what they're saying, don't take out words other than filler words, basically. But filler words, you don't have to leave them in, because then every quote would look kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, but you can do it if you want to like cut out a chunk of the quote where you think you can do a ... Like, but the one thing is when you're doing, like, because you basically put like a little like ellipses in between the part you cut. And if you're sending it to an editor, my tip is always put in a little comment on your article what that was taken out. But really the rule of thumb is don't take things out of quotes unless it's really necessary, because when a reader sees those ... they wonder what was cut out. Did they try to change the way the person talked? Same with when you use brackets. Kind of if someone used a word that's confusing and you need to like, or they said it, but you have to verify what it is, like, and you use brackets to fill in like the proper noun or something. Only ever use these things unless really necessary to make the point clear, because otherwise people are going to wonder, why did they change something? So again, it's a lot of judgment calls, things that you could ask your editors and they would always be happy to tell you if you're right or not about something.
And
The
sometimes when writers are putting in quotes and they put too many brackets out for like grammatical reasons, sources don't have to speak with perfect like standard English grammar. Like it's just not the way that normal people speak. So if you try to change too much to make it sound like what you would put in a proper English essay or whatever, it's just not gonna sound natural, and it's unnecessary brackets. So there's no need to change someone's grammar or fix someone's grammar unless it's so wrong that you basically can't tell what they're saying.
All right. So the next question is, what are the best places to fact check people in your story who are private people? I think we mentioned before, I would say White Pages. I've also used like Spokeo, but you need an account for that. Honestly, your newspaper, or if you're working somewhere, might have specific accounts. At the Freep, we've always used White Pages because it's free. You could always invest yourself into the more in-depth softwares that gets you a little more detail. But you probably don't have to do that early on in your career, I'd say.
And another important way you can fact check your sources is making sure that they say in the audio how to spell their name, so you have it on the recording.
Yeah, always get, my tip, we require this for free, but not every place is the same, but always get full names spelled out, their age, and where they live, like their neighborhood, I'd say, and even occupation is really good too for context. And also important, this is something that honestly we haven't been as good of implementing early times, but it's really important because things can get wrong. Ask for pronouns. Even if you think it's obvious, just ask. You don't want to get that wrong in an article. And it's just another kind of tick on the list of things to make sure you get from someone when you're interviewing them. Yeah. Okay, next question. How do you respond if a source feels misrepresented? If someone feels misrepresented, is that a failure on the reporter's part? I would not say it's a failure unless the reporter literally did something to actually misrepresent them. Honestly, a lot of times people feel they're misrepresented and they're just annoyed about how they came across. A lot of people don't realize how they come across. You're gonna get emails and tweets in your time as a reporter saying, this is ridiculous. Like, you're gonna get it. This is one of those things where you talk to your editor and you say, should they be mad? Did I do something wrong? And a lot of time you probably didn't. You're just gonna find that people get mad, and that's kind of the job.
Of course, do be open to taking criticism. Like if you did misrepresent someone, it's possible. Just be open to thinking that it is a possibility, but also like don't let those comments kind of gaslight you into thinking that you misrepresented someone when in reality they just didn't like what they said.
Yeah, I would, if someone says I don't like the way you talked or you twisted my words, ask them, why did you, what do you think I did? And a lot of times when there are people that are just saying that because they're annoyed about what they said, they're not going to really have much to say. They're kind of going to say some stupid answer that you're like, okay. But if someone points out, you wrote this, normally, most of the time when it's actually misrepresenting, it's like not a quote that you did from them. It's like, this little sentence right here, this isn't true. This is this. Like, that's when you could tell that there's more of a correction needed than like someone just being annoyed because they didn't like how they sound in the article. Okay. Next, what do you weigh when revealing private correspondence? For example, can you explain the decision to publish the story about the memo to CAS professors? In case anyone doesn't know about this, about what this letter this person's talking about. So Boston University's College of Arts and Sciences sent an email out to all professors in the department, basically doing a bunch of guidelines on how to communicate with students about coronavirus. And being on campus this semester, and basically it was a really
They were
crazy,
dictating what words you could use, what word, not necessarily dictating, but strongly pushing that you
strongly
stay away from these words.
But yeah,
stay away from these words, these connotations, use these words instead, focus on the positive.
Yeah, you can't say the word online.
Yeah, so firstly, I would say, because this is the university and they're an institution in power, it's not private correspondence. It is private, but at the same time, it doesn't deserve to have the rights to privacy because they serve the BU community, and anything that they do that could bring harm in any way, or anything really that deserves to be known by the student body or by the community in general, that we have the right to publish that, and we do not feel bad about publishing that, because like there's a difference between BU as an institution and the administration itself, as compared to like if a professor did something, then we have to take into consideration the professor's privacy depending on what the issue is. But because BU is an institution that, even though it's a private school, it's still basically a form of government. So in that way, that's why there was very little hesitancy to publish something like that.
Yeah, that's something, especially when it's something you think everyone really needs to know. Like, that's something that the student body deserve to know, what their department heads are sending out to their professors about how to talk to them. It's kind of a no-brainer there. Of course, when it's something that's a little more sensitive, just, talk it out and think, is this gonna hurt someone? And obviously this email is not gonna hurt anyone, except maybe make the administration look bad, which is not something that you ever have to really consider. Like, oh no, is this gonna make the administration look bad? Like, no, that's never something you need to consider, like, as a harm that we were talking about before. Next question, are there times when you use online sources as opposed to interviewing people in person? How can you verify that your source is factual? Are there sites you can particularly stay away from? So I guess I would say sometimes you might do short interviews over Facebook or Twitter. It's not ideal. Always try to talk to someone on the phone because quotes are the best, but you also might get email responses. Always, again, like I said, push to get talking sources. People just sound better when they're quoted and they're not rehearsed and they don't have time to type out what they're saying. They can be asked things on the spot, but honestly, like, as long as you just verify that profiles are legit, that's the only place I'd say when you're interviewing people remotely. Yeah, honestly, you can tell when someone's not real or not. Maybe if you're really like, if it's, let's say, like a profile that you're not sure if it's the real person, like, ask them to prove it to you. But I don't think I've ever really come into a situation where I've questioned someone that I was talking to online or anything. Most of the time, because when I'm talking to someone on an online way, I reached out to them. I know there's an instance at my internship right now, there was a girl I was talking to over Twitter who, it was something about a COVID testing and getting a COVID call, and I had her send me her COVID lab results to confirm that her story was true. Things like that. If kind of, again, judgment, I guess I'd say. I don't know if you want to add anything, Angela.
In case they're talking about like non-people sources, we do use press releases as like a starting point. We can quote from press releases. They're good basic information, but obviously they're just like the very foundational level that you then build off by talking to people. So you never are going to have a story where you're not going to talk to anyone. Just even if it has to be an email interview, which is not ideal, make sure to at least talk to some people as sources. We don't ever, sometimes we can, for context, like take information from research reports, things like that. One place that we never take information from online is other news outlets, because they're getting that information from somewhere else too. Find it from the source. They're literally your competitor. Don't do something according to the Boston Globe, for example. Like, where did the Boston Globe get it from? Unless it's like an investigation that they did themselves. But yeah, don't ever quote news outlets unless they are the primary source.
Next question, how has the Daily Free Press adapted to the ever-changing circumstances present in the pandemic? Yeah, honestly, still doing it. I mean, we're doing this because something we do a lot in person in Boston is we run workshops, we run panels, and we're like, we want to be available to students online, so that's why we're doing this. But I think Angela can talk a little bit about some of the changes we've made now that we have been working remotely.
Yeah, we actually went online back in March, or we went remote in March. So that was when we still had Victoria as our editor-in-chief. And I don't know, I feel like the transition wasn't too difficult because we do use Slack a lot in the newsroom anyways. So it's still Slacking each other, everything. It's less efficient in the way that you can't just yell across the newsroom and check up on something. But it really depends on your staff. Of course, if you have a committed e-board, they're still going to do their jobs even if it is remote. I would say obviously there are probably time conflicts if people have like family stuff at home or things like that. But part of dealing with this pandemic is just being more empathetic and working with people as situations change. So just always be open-minded. Like, we used to be so strict about enforcing everyone being in the newsroom, but we realized that like now we are still able to adapt to.
Okay, is it recording?
Yeah, all right, awesome. Yeah, so the first factor of newsworthiness that I want to go over is timeliness, which is kind of self-explanatory. Like, it's something that recently happened or maybe a news that just broke. Most often they can come from press releases. So for example, if it's a school press release, then it's like be emailing an announcement out to the student body, or for the city or the state, it could be the government or the governor issuing an executive order, anything like that. So just be really aware and follow everything that's going on your school's website and on your school's Twitter, or same thing with the city and the state. Be sure to always check their press releases and always follow their Twitters. Twitter is honestly a really great resource for immediate information. Like, even not just necessarily press announcements, but tweets from students or local residents that are talking about something that just happened, that can alert you to news that just broke. And so the second factor is proximity. So especially as a local paper, you really have to make choices about what is relevant to your community. So focusing on national news when you're a college newspaper, for example, isn't really efficient. Firstly, you don't have the resources to report that well nationally, but also you have so much power to tell the stories of the community that surrounds you. So that's actually really important because that community is the one that really needs you the most. So make use of the platform you're given. For example, like a college or a high school newspaper is a school's only news source, really, that's dedicated to covering that specific campus. So no other paper, even local papers, will be able to serve a specific school like its own newspaper. So you really are the first watchdog of your school's administration, and that's really important. So a third factor of newsworthiness is impacts. So that's basically how big of a deal this is, how many people are involved, and how many people are affected. So we dedicated basically the entirety of this summer to covering mostly the pandemic and the reopening procedures, because those are the issues with the biggest impacts right now. There are so many people affected: students, faculty, local businesses, parents, the elderly, everyone. But on the other hand, a story that we're working on right now about the university changing its parking pass verification system it's still news, but it's also way lower on the radar just because it's not as much impact because so few people bring cars to a city school. Like, of course, different audiences will have different levels of impact on certain issues. Like, at a school in a suburb in California, the parking story will probably be way bigger. So basically just ask yourself whether your audience would care about the story, and if so, why should they care? And another factor, of course, is human interest. So that ventures into soft news territory, not necessarily hard news. It's great for future stories. Does Sarah want to kind of go into looking for those ideas or why that's newsworthy?
Didn't realize I was muted. Yeah, so a big part of, writing feature stories is you want to talk about the why and the how. Those are the big questions that you're looking to answer. And features especially is such a great opportunity to share other people's stories. And, that's what people want to know is just what's going on in other people's lives. What are they working on? What challenges are they facing? And that really can show it can show your reader what's happening around them.
Yeah, and it's human interest stories are honestly really, really insightful because they can cover so many unique situations that a community is facing. Like, for example, after everyone left, there are several students who were still on campus at BU back in March, and kind of like looking at a glimpse into their lives is really insightful and interesting. And that's not necessarily breaking news or anything, but it's still human interest. People love reading about people, especially ones that they know. So yeah, and also they tend to be stories that evoke emotion. So whether it be like just curiosity or inspiration or empathy, like things like that. The point of focusing on an individual or on a community who's not necessarily the breaking news topic at the moment is that a look into their life provides some sort of insight that's still worth sharing.
Yeah, and even you can add human interest to your news stories too. It's just not just the what is the news, but how is it going to affect people? And so that's why you really want to get those student quotes or those resident quotes and understand more of the story than just, the politician who is putting out a new policy. You want to know, like, how is it going to affect people?
Right, so the fundamental question to keep in mind when you're story searching is basically, what questions will this story answer? So like, always aim to provide new information, because the story won't have much to offer if you can't find new angles to explore. If you're basically repeating a press release, then there's no point in doing that story. You're taking the initial information that you have and you're using that as a starting point to guide your reporting. And especially as a student paper, you may not have the resources to beat bigger regional papers when it comes to speed, but it's definitely possible to outdo them sometimes in terms of depth. So because a lot of papers are just rushing to break a story, but if you aren't able to publish it in the next hour, then take more time, but make it an interesting and well fleshed out story. I think that's what really adds value to the work of a student outlet when other outlets are competing to report on the same subject.
And always, sorry guys, I got kicked out before my computer freaked out. Happy it's still working, but yeah, I guess I would say is, sorry, another thing popped up on my computer. Okay, sorry, my Zoom is freaking out. I would just say, like, always, if there's a big national thing going on, try to figure out how you can localize it to your campus, because obviously not every big national news story is going to have relevance to your campus, but a lot of them do. And obviously, like, if the presidential election, like, you obviously aren't going to be breaking the news of who wins for president, but think about, how are students caring about who won? How is this affecting students on campus? Are there watch parties? You know what I mean? Always think about how bigger issues have an effect on students, and think, would I care about this if I wasn't a reporter? That's kind of a way to determine, like, an idea for a story a lot often.
All right, I think that's the end of this slide. Are there any questions that people want to send in? Okay. I don't think so. All right. So next we're going to go into the search for story ideas, basically. So we're going to start off with hard news ideas. The easiest way to get ideas, obviously, are press releases. And so I guess we can start off by talking about getting added to press lists if you're not already. Usually if you join a paper, they'll already be signed up to a bunch of different press lists, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you're an independent journalist working for yourself or a freelancer, I would say a few tips are: find the media relations person of the organization that you want to keep up with, whether it be a politician's campaign team or a nonprofit, an artist, or whatever. I remember when we were trying to get press access to the major presidential watch party events in New Hampshire on the night of that first primary. We found access basically by just emailing local, like the New Hampshire chapter of their campaign's press person. I even DM'd some people on Twitter, and it actually worked. So just reach out to people through email, Twitter, make sure to find the local press person who handles all that, and then ask them to get added to the press list, and then you will be. And yeah, this is something that Haley just talked about, basically. Oh wait, actually, there's a lot more to say about press releases. I want to kind of go over which press releases are newsworthy, because that really depends on your audience. Like if you're a college paper, you're probably not going to be covering mortgage news. Like a lot of companies are going to have you added to their press list automatically just because they're searching for your local news outlets, and then they find you and then they add you, but that doesn't mean that the things they send you are going to be relevant. So you're not going to be covering things that don't really affect your audience. And yeah, basically, sometimes you'll get news that could be relevant to another section. Like if you're getting a bunch of musician press releases, like at a college paper, you can send that over to the features or arts and entertainment section to see if they want to report on it. Basically, use judgment to see what stories are actually relevant from the press releases. You don't need to be reporting on a tech company's new CFO, but usually the ones that are most relevant are government press releases, transit press releases, especially if you live in a city where people use the subway or the train a lot. Yeah, so Haley kind of went over localizing larger scale stories. If you're covering a big political event, for example, you know that national outlets will be there. So maybe ask the politician something about their plan for loan forgiveness, like student loan forgiveness, which that's not a topic that really trends in big media, but it is relevant to your audience. So yeah, don't just ask them to repeat their campaign platform, but instead kind of shine the spotlight on something that serves your community more specifically. And of course, federal
I think to add.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, to add to that too, is when you see big news break from large outlets like New York Times or Reuters or something, just thinking like, how would this affect my community, or what are my friends saying about this? Like, what are people complaining about? I think is one way to definitely find story ideas. Because I think similar to like what was said before is that you're never going to be able to like make the exact time frame turnaround of being able to publish a story within 2 minutes of it being released because you found out before everyone else. Your college paper just won't have like those same connections and resources as a massive national publication. But the college paper does have the power to be able to really humanize a story and talk about how your community will be impacted, which is really beautiful and important. And so I think it's just thinking like, how are the people around me going to be impacted? And I've certainly found like a lot of ideas from like these big stories happening and then just sort of narrowing it down to the individuals that are impacted in your.
And a good way to find that is by just asking yourself questions and asking people you know questions. So, just thinking to yourself, like, what might the effects be from this national story? And then, like was already said, asking people who you know how they feel about that topic.
Yeah, and I would say one thing to never, like, don't underestimate how much story ideas you can get from social media, especially if, like, at the Freak, we have inboxes set up kind of for all our editors that do have this, like, huge pile of press releases because we've existed for a while. But if you're a reporter and you're just thinking of things to pitch, like, follow on Twitter other local reporters. You know what I mean? Like, follow other college journalists, see what they're doing at their colleges, and take that idea and say, hey, is this happening at my university? We can all drop our Twitters in the comments if you want, so you can kind of see what we do. But I would just say, like, follow your local representatives, follow everyone on Twitter, make Twitter lists, and then just see what people are doing, see what people are talking about, and you could really find ideas. Same with Facebook groups, or even go on your university's Reddit and see what people are complaining about, because there's so many story ideas. And I'm going to drop my Twitter. Everyone, all the other panelists are going to do that too. But yeah, like, I'm telling you, you can get so many ideas just from, like, looking at what other people are doing, and not like stealing, but like applying it to your own university.
Yeah, and that kind of led into our third point, which is find unanswered questions in other news stories. Sorry. I think that, like, any news story, it's not going to be all comprehensive. There are stories that are going to give you really, really good information, really complex information, but oftentimes you'll still have questions about something. So let your own curiosities lead you, and if something interests you, then your readers are probably wondering the same thing. So make sure to really follow all your local news outlets, by the way. Like, subscribe to them, because first of all, they're worth reading, and local news coverage is amazing, but also it does help drive your own coverage. So next would be investigative stories.
Yeah, so investigative is really cool in that it can be even its, like, own section, really. Like, sometimes there will be opportunities or news outlets where, like, that is entirely what they're dedicated to. But even just being on a school paper, you will do investigative work in almost all of the stories that you do, just in different facets and different depths. I think one big thing is, again, like, listen to what people are complaining about, and you often may find disparities and inequalities through that. I think also watching for statistics, if you see, like, there's a sudden rise in COVID cases in this specific county. I remember someone telling me about even an investigative story they did where they lived in a town where almost all of the small businesses were coffee shops, and, like, every year coffee shops would go under, and then there would be more coffee shops. Like, it was like a coffee laundering scheme, basically. And they investigated, like, why are, like, all of the main small businesses coffee shops? Like, I think that no question is too small or too big, and that definitely investigative reporting is so important. And you see it on the big scale of even in Boston's backyard with the Spotlight team covering the Catholic priests that were sexually abusing children, to obviously covering why are there so many coffee shops in this one part of town. Investigative reporting is a very powerful tool, and I think one of the big facets behind it is just research too. So I think when you have maybe an idea or you see something, doing research and maybe those first couple of statistics or the lack of story reporting that has been done can really inspire you and sort of lead you down a whole new path of things that you will discover.
And an important question to ask for all news stories, but especially in investigative pieces, is when you're talking to a source, then you can finish your interview and ask them, who else should I be talking to? Who else will have more information to help me? That's a really big question to be asking.
Also, definitely look at data trends if you're trying to do an investigative story, because stats tell you so much. They're basically a treasure trove of untold stories. I mean, like, those data trends are the result of something. So use them as a starting point to work backwards and find what the cause actually is, especially if you find a correlation that is really interesting. And obviously just observe the world around you. Like, when you walk, maybe walk without your headphones in, listen to what is going on, engage in conversations, just be attentive.
Do we have any questions on hard news before we start soft news?
So
if
there's
everyone
one,
wants to- go ahead, Sarah.
there's one question about the program. When will editors from the faith be able to work closely with students one-on-one? So basically, we're going to release more information about this later, but next Wednesday, we're going to have meeting rooms, like individual meeting rooms with different section editors where if you're interested in a certain type of news, like for example, features, sports, opinion, hard news, whatever, you get to go into those rooms and you get to have your cameras on, your mics on, interact with those editors when you pitch your stories, which we're going to talk about later. And then at the end of the workshop, the last day, we're also gonna basically, or like near the end of the workshop when you guys get your stories in, we're gonna work with you one-on-one on those stories. But in between, I'll also send out more information on this later, but we're gonna check up on you guys and give you basically mentorship as you work throughout these 2 weeks.
All right, so soft news or features, there's a lot that we can do with features. They can be longer form stories and really delve in and take a deep look into a certain topic or a certain person even. So the first type of feature story that I'll talk about is profiles. So you can take a certain person who's maybe heavily involved in either an organization or whatever topic it is that you're interested in looking at, and you want to really try to tell their story. So maybe it's how they got into the field, or you know, what they're planning to do with their work, and you really want to know like their passion, what they're passionate about. Really get to know them as a person and as whatever they're working as, and you want to really try to tell their story. And then it doesn't have to be just a specific person. It can be an organization or a business. Maybe it's a nonprofit. And you still want your feature stories to be timely. So you're not just gonna like talk to the owner of a restaurant that's been around for 30 years if nothing's changed. You really want it to be either they're implementing a new program, or it could be a startup or a brand new company, something that you really want to cover, something that's changing within it. So then that could be either what were they before and what are they becoming, or what was their process like to get to where they are. So then we have event coverage, and yeah, so the way that event coverage differs from news event coverage would be just the depth of the why. That's really what it always comes back around to is, so say you're covering a talk and you want to talk to the speaker and understand like why they're there, what message do they have to share with the audience at the event, and then show your reader through your article what happened at the event, what it felt like to be there. So maybe it was like a concert. What was the vibe of it? How did the audience interact with the performer? So that's something you'll hear as you get further into journalism, is show, not tell. And we really stress that, especially in features, to really show what's happening, how it feels, really get that emotion out of your sources. And also with, you know, maybe like talk type events, you can get more information from the speaker maybe after or before the talk to get a little bit more information than what they shared. And similar to what you would do if you're profiling someone, is just ask them like their passion. What reason do they have to bring this topic to the community, and why do they think it's important? And then you want to talk to the attendees and find out why the attendees came and what they got out of it. And then there's lifestyle. I think coronavirus is the best example right now of lifestyle stories. There's so much you can do. You know, it's changed everyone's life. So from working from home, and you know, gyms are closed. So how are people getting their exercise in? And how are students adapting to learning online? And you know, even like most of us are becoming more sedentary in our lifestyles, but think about doctors, like they've been nonstop for months. So even being able to tell their story of how their life has changed. So I think that coronavirus poses a really good opportunity for lifestyle stories, to look at trends, look at how people's lives are being changed and affected by whatever's going on, and understand those differences, and how you can even look further into how it's affecting people, like in a deeper way, like what kind of toll does it have on the body or mind. Yeah. And then you also have informational features. So this can be maybe like a This Day in History segment, or infographics, or listicles, or timelines, things like that. And then you also can do explainers. So this might be like a political or a science explainer, where you really you research your topic really well and delve into a really specific topic and explain it in a way that your reader can understand. And then, yeah, we already talked about this, using social media to find stories. It's a great tool. You can follow accounts like within your specific beat or your interest area, and see what people are talking about, see what new maybe programs or that kind of changes that are going on, and yeah, really just see what people are interested in, especially your own audience, and what's happening in your community that you can report on.
So once you find your story idea and you're ready to get started, this is the fun part. You're actually going to start reporting. So how do you find sources? Basically look for whoever is involved, whoever is affected, whether directly or indirectly. So for example, if you have legislation that shuts down a bunch of homeless shelters in a city where the homeless problem is rampant, then whoever's involved would be probably the mayor's office or whichever department in the city is doing this, or the state. So find legislators, find department, communications people, whoever is involved in creating the news, and whoever's affected. So like directly, for example, the homeless shelters would be affected directly, but indirectly would be all the unhoused people who now may not have access to those shelters. So things like that. And of course, for every story, there is probably an advocacy group that is going to have an opinion on it. There are advocacy groups for pretty much everything, like of course social issues, but like transportation, housing, climate, pretty much any sort of topic, there's going to be a group that's passionate about it. So find those local groups. And if it affects any profession, look for local union branches, especially if it's like a major labor union that has a chapter in your area. Talk to those people. And of course, look for experts. Those could be professors, scientists, medical professionals, lawyers, people like that. And consulting groups are actually a really great source too, because they're literally professionals whose job is to advise companies on how to do things, and so they have a lot of insight on certain issues. And just get really creative when you can't find sources, because you can always think of something. I remember one time, one of my stories, I just didn't feel like I had enough good sources. It was about Boston, the city of Boston, making its digital content more accessible to those with language barriers or like visual disabilities. So of course I reached out to the mayor's office and all the relevant advocacy groups, but it just didn't really work out the way I wanted to. So I started just cold calling a bunch of marketing and PR firms, because I thought, wouldn't they also have to focus on marketing to people who aren't as like able-bodied, or like as like they'll probably be able to think of creative solutions, because that's part of their job. And so one of my best interviews in that story was actually from a communications firm. So that was really unexpected. So just be creative.
My tip would be reach out to way more people than you need to. Of course, you don't want to waste your time, so you don't want to ask people that you know aren't actually going to be a good source. But like when you get your assignment right away, like a lot of times, like for us, our editors often give a list of sources we want you to contact. Your editor might not do that. That's not necessarily a common practice. But even if you are given people that you can contact, like just go beyond and find as many people as you can. I remember we always used to like to get expert sources for stories, like on our city news stories, and it'd be like talk to a professor like in so like a politics professor for this city story, like anyone in Boston. I literally would email like full departments, like hundreds of people sometimes, because it's like people don't get back to you, people are annoying, sources aren't always reliable. You always want to have too many sources if you can, because the last thing you want is to be on deadline and you're like, I've only talked to one person, my story's not finished. You just always want to make sure you have as many potential sources. You can always cut them if you don't think they're relevant or if it's repetitive.
Yeah, so sorry.
Angela,
so we didn't talk about reaching out to those sources. So basically you want to email them right away, but if right away means like 3 a.m., don't do that. Ideally, if it's like a corporate or a government profession, then they would start their workday around 9 a.m. So try to email at 9 a.m. Monday through Friday. Schedule the email if necessary, but try not to reach them at a time where they're probably just not going to be checking their work email. So emailing, first of all, it's not the way that you want to interview the source. It's just to kind of notify them that you want their attention, and it allows them to prepare to talk to you about the subject if they're willing to. So it's almost like a gesture of courtesy. It's not really like the way you want to interview them. So if the source doesn't respond, so basically when you email them at first, you tell them who you are, how you found them, why you think they would be a relevant opinion to the story, or why their expertise is going to be useful. So you tell them that, and then you ask if they're willing to have an interview, like a phone call sometime later today or whatever time works for you. Or if they don't respond within a few hours, email them again, or just start cold calling them, because sometimes people see the email, they're not unwilling to respond, they just forgot about it. So just be persistent, email every hour if you need to. Like don't be persistent, but don't be pushy. Always be respectful of their time. Never demand an interview from anyone, but do persist until they either refuse or they tell you they are willing.
I will say the one time to be pushy is when you know people are ignoring you and you need to talk. This is more for like government agencies, I'd say, or like sources that really matter. Like don't be afraid to be pushy if you know that because people will ignore you, whether it be a department of your school. Those are more tricky to deal with because they get mad at student newspapers a lot. But it's like if an office, like a city council office or something, isn't answering you, and it's because it's an article that they might not really feel too like something, they might not like the topic of it, like keep emailing them, because just be like, I'm going to publish this and I'm going to say that you did not, like you refused to comment. And that typically, like after, don't ever be like to them like, oh, I said you weren't going to comment if you only email them once, because that's not really trying hard enough. If you call someone 5 times, you email them 5 times, you say, hey, if you don't answer me, I'm going to say that you would not comment on this story. And a lot of times that gets people to answer. A lot of times it doesn't. It's just a matter of figuring out if they're a person that's essential to the story. A random other like source that you're trying to get is like background info. That doesn't mean, I see a little thing that popped up. Isn't that threatening? No, that's not threatening to say that. It's not threatening to say I'm going to say you didn't comment if they didn't comment. And this is, I'm not talking about like private citizens. I'm talking about public entities, schools, press people, especially press people, because they will act like they don't have to answer you, and it's their job to answer you. And not answering is an answer, especially when you make multiple points of contact. And it's not threatening unless you literally are saying, if you were to say like, I'm going to twist your words and make it seem like you don't like this, like, no. But if you're just saying that they didn't comment when you gave them the chance to comment, like be like, we reached out multiple times and they refused to comment or didn't answer, whatever it is.
Yeah. And that's just standard journalistic practice. If a source is essential to the story, if there is someone in power who is directly related to what's happening in the story, then well, your readers need to know that you at least, like, that you did reach out to them, and it's not the reporter's obligation if the source just does not, or the authority just does not comment. Like, that's on them, and they know that. So in fact, telling them that you're going to publish that they're not commenting is kind of reminding them of something that you should be doing anyways.
Yeah, especially because if you don't put, like, you don't obviously have to write, oh, they refuse to comment if it's someone that's not essential to the story, like an expert you're reaching out to. But if it is like the government agency or the department of the school that you're reporting on and they literally won't answer you, people are going to comment on the article and say, if you don't put like no, that they said no comment, they're going to be like, why didn't you try to talk to them? Because they don't know unless you say. So a lot of the biggest like thing I could say when you're writing a story is like, what are people going to think when they read this? Like, what, again, when we talk about what questions are they going to have, I don't want people to have questions about why something's not in my article. So that's kind of what I think about that.
Also, just a few tips before we move on to the next bullet point. If a source offers information on background, you cannot attribute it to that person. That's, if it's like, whether it's an interview or just an email response, if they give you information on background, do not name them, do not quote them. You could quote them if you just don't. It's like really complicated because it could mean different things depending on the news organization and their policies. But in general, like, we've had writers make this mistake in the past, and then press people have been really angry with us. But if a source offers you information and they say it's on background, that's not a real source. You can use that as information to help you guide your reporting, but do not quote those people.
I also would like to add that if you, kind of on the other hand of this, if you're identifying yourself as a reporter of someone and they talk to you, even if it's not strictly under the guise of an interview, and like, let's say you're taking notes of what they're saying, or they email you, like, you can use that if they then go back and say, oh wait, I didn't say that was on the record, like, unless obviously you could understand in certain situations where you might be like, okay, fine, like, let's talk separately. But this happened once with a situation with a leader of a club. We had a controversial speaker coming to campus, and one of our editors texted this leader of the club, or like someone in the club, and asked that the club that was bringing him and said, hey, is he coming? She says yes. She knows she's talking to a journalist. Then they were mad that we published that. But the thing is, when people know, especially press people, know when they're talking to a journalist, they should know that that's information that can be used. So if someone doesn't say off the record, I mean, you always want to clarify, but if someone's talking to you under the guise of you being a journalist, like, don't let them tell you, oh, well, actually, I didn't say that. Like, you know what I mean? Stand your ground if you believe that you are in the right about things, because people will try to take advantage of you, especially as young journalists. They think you don't know what you're allowed to do, I'd say.
Yeah, so preparing for an interview, definitely.
There's a question, I don't know if we answered it. It says, will a source feel annoyed if they spend time talking to you and then you don't mention them in an article? I would say a great thing to do in that type of situation, or in any interview situation, is if you're going to be interviewing someone, it's important to let them know that you may not use the information always, because that does happen, where it could even be a relatively official source, and then you find someone higher up who says something better or whatever it may be, and you want to use that information instead. So they may be upset with you, but if you at least give them the information beforehand that, hey, I may not use this, I just want you to know, that's at least going to put you in the clear and give them some sort of reassurance for it.
Yeah, I would say you don't always, like, that's only in the case I would say if you knew for sure that you might not be using it. But if someone's mad at you, there's a lot of reasons that people you interview are going to be mad at you, and almost 80% of the time, like, there's not actually a good reason. It's just how journalism works. Sometimes you literally do full interviews for a whole article and the article gets cut. You don't owe anything to the people that you interview. Of course, you do thank them for their time. Always email a thank you. You know, you want to keep them as a valuable source, but just say, hey, I'm sorry that your quote didn't make it, or I'm sorry this didn't turn into a story, but it was really helpful for my insight. It's going to help me with further reporting. I'd love to talk to you for something similar in the future. Just don't let people, would say, push you around. They're going to think people don't respect journalists a lot in general, especially student journalists, because they think, oh, they're young, they might not know. don't let anyone make you feel bad for using your discretion as a reporter, I'd say.
And there's another question that says, how many different sources do you recommend having for each story? Well, first I kind of want to define like what sources are compared to, like for at least at our student paper, we don't consider student quotes or resident quotes sources because they're not really, they're providing opinions, they're like reactions, and they're relevant, but they're not helping you develop the story. So those wouldn't count as sources. If you really want a number, I would say like the minimum would be probably 2 or 3 for a full story. But honestly, how many sources you should have is however many that like each individually add a different sort of value to your story. You obviously don't want source, like if you interviewed a bunch of people, you don't have to feel obligated to put them all in, especially if they all are repeating the same kind of idea. You want to find the person who spoke the best on a certain idea that is not repeated anywhere, and then you put that in. So just use your own judgment, put in the sources that individually contribute value to your story.
I would also say, even if you have, let's say you have an article that's on a slightly controversial topic that has 2 sides to it, if you have 5 sources but they're all on one side, it doesn't matter that you have 5 sources. It's not ready to be an article that's published because you don't have a whole other side missing. So there is like a quantity, definitely you should have, never have less than 2 or 3 sources in an article, like a full-length article, not like a brief or anything, but it's really about having everything reflected, like Angela said.
Yeah, so let's talk about how to prepare for an interview. Definitely do basic research on the topic itself, but also have some knowledge of the source's background. So the reason for this is, first of all, if you know a little bit about the topic, then it shows that you actually care. You took the time to get to know this person's work, and that makes them more enthusiastic about talking to you. It also saves you time because you don't want to have to ask questions that you could have just Googled. It's not very productive. And doing your research beforehand lets you be more specific and thorough in your questioning. So that way you can kind of bring out the specific nuances of a situation, which, I mean, that's what you really want the source for in the first place. You don't want them to just explain the issue to you, but you want them to add insights into that issue. So along with that, prepare a list of questions that you know you want them to answer, but obviously don't feel like you're going to be sticking to a script because things can change up in an interview, and it's always good to just follow the natural flow of what happens and let your curiosities lead the way.
I think also to add to that, don't be afraid to follow up with a question if they say something that you don't understand, or if they use terminology that may be foreign to you. Because if you don't understand it, your readers probably won't understand it either. So feel free to be like, can you explain that? What is your definition? I was once doing an article on like mortgage stuff, and they were throwing around all of these acronyms, and I just had to like stop and be like, okay, what exactly does that mean? And people are typically happy to comply and help you out, and that will help with your writing.
Yeah. Never let your ego get in the way of your reporting. If you think it's a stupid question, but it's still a question that you have, just ask it anyways.
Also, it's always okay when you prepare your questions to run them by someone else. I know I still run my questions by Angela and Sarah and just say like, hey, can I get a second opinion on this? I'm not entirely sure if I'm missing anything. Sometimes it's good to just get a second set of eyes on it.
I see a few questions in the Q&A box, but we're going to cover that in this slide, I think. So yeah, ethics of interviewing. First of all, of course, always make sure that they know you're a reporter and they know that it's on the record. When you're recording the conversation, first of all, it's always good to record, but the rules for consent differ by state. Like Massachusetts is a two-party consent state, so even if you like don't think that they would mind, you still need to ask them to record, or else it's literally illegal. But I would say, even if you're in a one-party state, like I believe California is, but always ask anyway, just out of courtesy. Like it's always good for them to know that they're being recorded, just so they know. And yeah, I guess those are the basic ethics that you need to keep in mind when interviewing someone. As for tools, when you're interviewing someone, you could use a variety of different things. Like the most common and obvious is a voice recorder. So whether that be on your phone or like a literal audio recorder device, whatever works, just test it first to make sure that it doesn't fail on you. It would suck to do a really good interview and then you just ended up not recording the whole thing. It's happened to us a few times. We've had writers who had to basically reach out to sources again and be like, can I re-interview you because my audio didn't work? But the pro of audio recording is it allows you to focus on listening rather than scrambling to jot everything down. And of course you get better accuracy. Like your source will never be able to say that you misquoted them if you send them the audio clip of them saying that exact quote. But obviously it can cut out or be unclear if there's background noise. So don't just rely on your recording and just be like, oh, I can zone out, I can just relax and not pay attention to what they're saying. Even if you can always come back to the recording later, still tune in and pay attention. And that's important for follow-up questions, as we'll go into later. But during the interview, yeah, go ahead.
I would also say, like, and this is something I've kind of had to do, I've noticed more at internships than at kind of doing my college newspaper, is that even a lot of times people, especially I'd say at internships and jobs, they expect you to have like text written up right away. Like whether it be like you attended a press conference, or like, okay, send me some quotes, and you're like, wait, I have to go through my transcription. Like that takes a while. Always be writing notes too. Maybe not if you're doing an in-person interview, it's harder, but especially if you're over the phone or you're at a press conference or something, take notes, try to get some full quotes down. That way, if your recording does mess up and stop working, you have something. Get the facts down, leave timestamps for important quotes in your recording. So if it's a 30-minute interview, you might not have time to go through the whole thing, especially if you're on deadline. So my biggest tip is just like do whatever you can to have as many options as possible. Have a recording for sure for everything, but also take notes the best you can, whether it be, if you like doing them, writing down physically. I personally, when I'm like, let's say covering a press conference or event, I like jotting them down on my notepad on my phone while my phone's recording. And then I can literally look at, like, in the corner of my phone, the timestamp, right where the timestamp was, and it's really easy. So just always make sure you're like, have every little checkbox marked on everything, because no matter what, mistakes still happen. I've had literally full stories where my full interviews for multiple interviews were erased. But you just want to be careful.
Yeah, definitely write down timestamps when you hear a good quote, so that you don't have to dig through a whole hour of a speech or a conversation just to find something. As for like apps that can help you out, what we use at the Freep a lot for phone interviews is Tape-A-Call. I don't use it anymore because it broke on me, but there are a bunch of different apps out there where you can record a phone conversation. So it's not like a voice recorder. You don't have to, like, you could be wearing headphones and it would still record the conversation. So those are really useful. There's also Otter.ai. It's also an app where it basically transcribes in real time. So it just saves you a lot of time. If you download that app, you record straight from there. And then once you finish the recording, it'll be processing for a few minutes, and then you'll have a very badly transcribed transcription, but it's there as a reference, so you can go and fix it. Yeah, I'll drop it in the chat.
Yeah, I've seen some people asking, like, do you record phone conversations, or are those mainly recorded via paper and pen? I always record phone conversations. That's how, honestly, most of your interviews are going to be over the phone. If I'm in a private room, like in my dorm or at home, I personally, like, you're going to learn that you might prefer not using a phone app when you can. So I have this app on my computer that's just like simple recorder. I put my phone on speaker and I record through my computer, while of course still taking some notes. If I'm in a busy place and I have to have my phone to my ear, again, I use those apps that we're going to put in the chat, which you kind of have to tinker around with, do some test trials, figure out how they work. It's kind of hard to explain. remotely how they work. But just have multiple options. If you are alone, you can do it on speaker and record on your computer, but record everything while asking. But I'm telling you, like, if you don't record, no matter what, you're not going to get everything exactly the way you need it, I'd say.
And that's why handwritten notes, I feel like, are outdated. Like, they're good for observations. If you're at the scene of something, you want to write down quick notes about what you see. Obviously, that's good. But if you use that for an interview, that's just going to leave you with a bunch of half quotes, and just it's going to be really stressful. So I would say always rely mostly on recording. Use typed or hand notes as kind of supplementary notes.
Yeah, and I like to use my handwritten notes mostly just to write down questions as I have them. Like if somebody's saying something really important and I don't want to interject, but I have a question, a follow-up question that I'm thinking of, you can just like write it down on your notepad. Also, something that I've started doing is I will tell people like why I have my notepad out. I'm like, this is just for me. This is just to collect my thoughts, because sometimes it actually does freak the person you're interviewing out. So it's always just good to like tell them, here's why I'm recording. Here's why I have my notepad, just to get any sort of worries or apprehensions they have out of the way. Also, this is more like long game because like Haley said, a lot of the interviews that we at least do in college and at the FREEP tend to be over the phone just because of that time frame, and also especially right now because of Corona. But one thing that is really important is if you are like a handwritten note taker, like I do really rely on my notes to collect my thoughts, you have to kind of learn how to take notes while still looking at the person, because you can miss like a really important moment for them where they're having like this, oh, I really like to talk about this. You can see it in their facial expression, but you don't necessarily hear it in the inflection of their voice. And that's follow-up questions that you've missed. So it's really important, if you're going to be a hand-taken note person, to either learn how to write efficiently and look up, or just like learn how to completely write like freehand with while still looking at the interviewee.
All right, so next we're going to talk about how to be effective at interviewing during the interview. So a few obvious things: always ask open-ended questions, unless you're aiming for a specific yes or no answer. Then in that case, obviously there's an exception. You want to ask questions that will evoke some kind of emotion. If it's information that you can research by yourself, if it's information that is in a press release, for example, then figure that out so that you don't end up asking for those just factual, boring tidbits during the conversation. You want to ask questions that will evoke some sort of like unique personal touch. You want their opinion, their specific expertise. So yeah, remember that. And always listen to their answers. Don't just be too focused on what questions to ask, because follow-up questions are so important. Sometimes the best information or the best quotes can come from follow-ups. You might think that you know what the questions are that you want to ask, but then they say something super interesting, and then it's not necessarily relevant to the original question, but it's still really like something that's just that you think you should focus on too. And so follow that curiosity, and it could lead you to something that could even overtake what the actual story is. It could lead you to something that you didn't even know was a story there. And this question from the Q&A, are you allowed to turn an interview into a conversation and offer your own viewpoints, or do you have to remain non-biased? So yeah, an interview is a conversation, but it's also not your conversation. It's you're interviewing the person. You may have your thoughts, but keep them to yourself. Like as a reporter, you want to know what they think. There's no point in sharing what you think, and in fact, it could be harmful to share what you think, because you don't want to lead them in any direction. You want to simply gain their perspective. That's the goal. So don't speak too much. Like you can comment just conversationally, but don't try to or like don't accidentally turn it into a conversation where you're debating something or discussing something when it's really still an interview.
Yeah, one of kind of the biggest tips I've received about like advice on how to do good interviews is say as little as possible. I mean, obviously your questions should be specific, but when someone's talking, don't interject. One, because it makes recordings kind of annoying if you start talking in the middle of someone's quote, but just like let someone speak. If there's an empty silence a little, let them wait and let them talk. Don't like talk over them, because honestly, people just like to talk. And the more you talk, the less quotes you're gonna get. If you start agreeing or saying, yeah, I really get that, one, you're making them know your opinion, which you don't want them to know your opinion on anything. But two, it's taking away things that they could say. Honestly, just be like, yes, sure, okay. Like, you know, like honestly, like if you need to like remind them that you're there, especially over the phone, speak as little as possible. People do mostly the talking. In some rare cases, you have to encourage people with more questions, but don't be afraid to not say much, which might not be like intuitive when you think of being a journalist. You think reporters ask a lot of questions, but a lot of it's about knowing when to stay silent.
And when you're
I've
covering,
also had some,
no, go
sorry,
ahead.
I was just gonna add, I've had some interviews too where the interviewee will say like, well, what do you think? Or what are your thoughts on this? Or what about that? And what I try to do best to like handle that situation is give them a really vague carrot, so they're like appeased and they're willing to talk to you more and you're building camaraderie and trust. But I'm not also like going on with these long-winded explanations. Yeah, it's kind of like an awkward line to toe because you want to contribute and like be a person with them, but at the same time, you don't want to get so off track. Typically, I find a way to try to revert that into a question of like, well, I did think about this, but what do you think? And then you can sort of shimmy it back over to them.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to touch on. Usually, especially when you're covering something controversial, people will ask you what you think about it, especially if they distrust the press. What I do is just say, well, I think it's more important what you think. Just turn it back around on them and don't feel the need to answer that.
Also, something that I like to do, and this isn't necessarily to answer this question, but Haley was talking about like when you have silence, it's really good. Also, something that at least at the Freef that we've started doing a lot is, well, or not a lot, but we've experimented with is using sound bites from people's interviews and actually placing them into an article to make it a multimedia piece. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, or anything along those lines, or even if you're just someone who says like, yes, like every other sentence, it can almost impede the interviewee's thought process. So especially for new writers, if they're really nervous, what I'll tell them to do is, if it's a phone call, just mute yourself. Like, it's fine. I had a phone call once and I muted myself, and then I started asking my question and I forgot I was on mute. And then he ended up, the person I was interviewing ended up talking for like another 10 minutes about it. And I was like, oh, well, that ended up great. So just mute yourself and like, it'll do wonders. It'll do wonders.
Yeah, definitely. Silence is such a useful tool. People hate awkward silences. They will fill it with something. And if you have tough questions, I would save them for the end, just so you get your other questions out of the way, so that if they end up refusing to answer something, or it just turns them into like a more negative mood, like at least that's not going to affect the rest of your interview. Also, one thing, a lot of people when they're speaking, they're not going to speak in super perfectly flowing sentences. They're going to have pauses. They're going to kind of cut off, and it's going to be like what I'm doing right now. Like, I can't finish my sentence, but give them time to finish their sentence. You don't need to feel the need to cut in and start asking the next question, or be like, oh, it's okay, you don't have to answer that. Just give them time to finish, because they will eventually finish, and then it'll be a point that they were trying to get across, and you may miss it if you just want to rush to the next question.
Also, something that's important, at least for questioning, I don't know if we said it, but open-ended questions are important. I'll let somebody else talk about that though, because I don't want to. But what I was going to say in regard to the actual questions that you're asking is it's okay to ask for clarification even multiple times. If you don't understand something they said, if the way they phrased it is confusing, it's going to be confusing for someone else, and you need to make sure that you have it every single detail completely right for your article, because a lot of the time you're only getting that specific bit of information from that one source, at least phrased in that manner. There have been times when I've had to ask someone to clarify something like 2 times, and I just say, I'm sorry, I don't understand, sorry to ask again, but can you please just make sure I have this correct? Like, they want you, just as much as you want to have the right information, they want you to attribute to them and to have the correct information that they told you. So a source is never really, well, I can't say that, but like typically a source is never going to be mad at you for asking for clarification. Just don't ask the literal same question again. Say, this is clarification.
Yeah, trust yourself that you're smart. If you're confused, everyone else is going to be too. Like, you are a smart individual. Have that confidence to be like, this person isn't making complete sense and I need more clarification.
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quickly, a lot of the times if you're talking to like an expert and not necessarily like a professor, they'll use a lot of jargon. And you might not know, like, you're not supposed to be like an expert in what you're, writing about per se. So it's good to kind of like ask questions like any other person would, like be a normal person and be like, I don't think like an average reader would know what this term is. So it's good to be a little dumb as a writer.
And especially because, like, in your story, you never want to use some sort of jargon that is really specific to a field. That's not really the way that journalistic stories work. You want to explain it in a way that's clear to your readers. So if it's not clear to you, it's not going to be clear to your readers. You don't want to put down the same jargon that they use. You want to make it understandable.
Yeah, so I see a comment that's, should you double check the position? Yeah, definitely don't be afraid to, if you don't know for sure, like, what someone is, like, what the position at a company is or whatever. Like, yeah, when you're on the interview, to say, hey, can you clarify what your role is, what your job is? A lot of times it might just be in their email bio, honestly, but never, if you are ever curious about something or worried about getting something wrong, especially like a fact check thing like that, ask. People aren't going to be offended. It's just going to be good for your reporting.
Also, something that's really good to do along those lines is, and this is more for stopping people on the street for an interview, or like something that we'll do is like student quotes. So I'll walk up to a random student and talk to them about an article, is to make sure you ask them how to spell their name. As like funny as that sounds, I've had a Kevin spelled Keven. So really anything can happen. And when, like, you always have to fact check what you're doing. So you have to make sure that person's a real person that you spoke to, that they didn't just give you a fake name or something like that. So you always have to go back and find out who they are, find out that it's a real person. And if you turn an article in, this is once you have a job too, like if you turn your article into your editor and they can't find that person, that entire article could potentially be scrapped. You could be in trouble, or you'll just have to last minute go out and get another source. So just always ask how to spell their name, what their position is, again, just because also their position may have changed as of today. They could have been promoted, and then they may get mad at you in a week and when they read the article, and they may say, hey, why didn't you change this? And then it just gets really sort of screwed up in that you might have to make an official correction, and then it looks bad on you, it looks bad on the paper. So it's just good to make sure you have all the information as far as identifiers go correct, as well as those, more critical interview quotes and stuff like that.
I think we recently actually had a case where the title on their employee page wasn't updated for a source, and so they like just got promoted, and we put their oldest position in the article, and then they got mad at us for that. So yeah, it's always good to check. If they have multiple different positions that they hold, ask them which job title they would like to go by.
So we have a question in the chat. with quotes, when we said that they're better in person, do you feel that you can represent someone better when they have more time to think and aren't getting flustered via email? So I would say no, because you don't want them to have time to think about how they want to present themselves to the public. It's better to get your quote live and they'll say what's right on their mind. You don't want them to say something they wouldn't say in a normal conversation just to make themselves look good for whoever's reading it. And also just when you're talking to someone, you can get more of that emotion. If they're writing an email response, they're just going to say the facts that you want. And you really want your questions to be questions that will evoke emotion. And those are the quotes that you want to use in your story, the ones that really show something that only that person would say. And you don't want them just, copy and pasting information that you could find online. You want stuff that's true to what they would say.
Yeah. So I would say the answer to that question is actually the opposite way around, where we don't want email interviews because that way it's not as authentic. They can really take the time to be really careful. It's just not true to what they would naturally answer. So you do want to catch them like on the spot. Like obviously don't try to be like sabotaging them, but you do want an interview where it is natural and they don't necessarily have time to think of what they want to say.
And
as we're nearing the end, if you guys want to keep sending in your questions about anything, just so they can kind of load up and we don't have to have a wait period. So just encouraging you all to send some in if you have any.
also, something that happens a lot with emails is after a source sends you their email, they will stop looking at any emails you send them afterwards because they'll think their job is done. So if you had a follow-up question, even just for clarification, it's essentially like you've almost lost that avenue of communication, at least for the deadline of your article. They may respond to you in, say, a week, but that's not going to help you for the article you're currently working on. So phone calls are always better for that reason as well.
And just thinking about your paper's credibility, and if you have, say you have 4 sources in your article and they're all emails, like what will the reader think? Like, why did this reporter get only emails? And so think about like that aspect too, and how will that represent your newspaper and your status as a reporter. It's better to have those spoken interviews.
I'd also like to just quickly add, in my experience, it saves you so much more time to do a phone call rather than an email, because kind of like what Melissa said, people usually don't get back to you over email or don't check it as frequently. But if you like just call them and get it out of the way, get all of your questions done, you can start on your story a lot faster, and it kind of like speeds up that process. So.
Also, when you're doing a phone call, oftentimes it's scheduled, so you know when you're going to have that interview. If you just allow them to answer your questions via email, you never know when they're going to get back to you. They're probably going to forget, and it's just going to be really stressful for you ultimately.
Yeah, and one thing that I know, especially when I was starting out as a reporter, I was scared of making phone calls, and I get that fear. Like, I hated making phone calls. I really didn't like even calling my mom on the phone sometimes. Like, phone calls stressed me out. Now, you learn that making a phone call first, obviously send an email first, I'd say almost always, but if you can make a call right away, like, make the call. The worst that happens is they don't answer and you leave a voicemail and then you send an email. But a lot of the times they do answer because they don't know who's calling. You know what I mean? Like, with an email, they can say, okay, it's a reporter, I don't have to deal with them. They don't know who you are when you're calling. They might answer. They're kind of backed into a spot where they have to start talking to you. So don't be afraid to make calls. It might be scary at first, but just think about the fact that they can't see you. It doesn't matter. Just anyone needs tips with how to make phone calls, honestly, that's something that I had to work hard on. So to ask if you do.
Yeah, there's also, sorry. No, do you have something to say about this? I was going to move on to the next question.
Yeah, I definitely relate to being scared to, especially cold call people, because sometimes you get flustered yourself, but really it just takes practice. Like, just do it, push yourself to do it. It's really not as hard as you make it seem to be in your head. Talking to people is really fun, actually. The more you do it, the less you're scared of it. Just don't be afraid to even if you're scared, just pick up the phone and just do it. Because in the end, like, they don't really know who you are. They're not going to judge you because you called them on the phone. It's not as scary as it seems.
And so there's another question that's sitting in here that says, are you allowed to experiment with different writing styles? For example, formatting the news in a hybrid format, a narrative, and then maybe just straight up question and answer. So a lot of the times, first off, your editor is going to tell you what they want from you. So you're going to be going into it looking for a specific type of article, probably traditional news, let's say. At Brief, we do have a little more leniency with it. If something, at least for the summer we have had during the school year, it gets a lot more up in the air, or a lot less up in the air, but we've had a few opportunities where we've been able to change an article into, say, an interview format where it's the question, the answer, something like that. So if you have that leniency, if you don't have an editor who said, do it hard news, I don't want to see anything else, I would say go into your article just knowing that. So if you do the first interview and it turns out that, hey, this was a really good interview, it could potentially be interesting to any reader just as a question and answer article, that's fine. Pitch it to your editor, do that. But you really just need to think about the reader and the audience. Is this what they're going to want to read? Is this something that's going to be understandable to them? Is this something that's going to be entertaining to them? And I don't mean entertaining like TV entertaining. I mean like this is going to get me to click on your article and read it.
Personally, I love narrative style stories. It really depends on the situation, of course. If it's a breaking news story that you're doing a brief about in the next hour, it's not going to be a narrative story. But especially for student papers, if you're not necessarily publishing the first version of events, if you're not trying to compete with national outlets who are trying to break the news or things like that, there are so many opportunities to ingrain an anecdotal lead into your article, and it just makes it so much more interesting. If you're covering something about the rent price is rising, interview someone who maybe is about to get evicted or is having trouble basically paying their rent, and they have a story to tell. A lot of the times these people happen to be the residents that you meet on the street, and they were originally going to be a resident quote, but their story is just really powerful, and so you can have that be your lead. Hard news and feature news. Hard news is more obviously a different style, but you can also ingrain feature writing into there. It really is up to what the content of the story is. Whenever there's an opportunity, it's always more interesting to have it be sort of narrative. But of course, it's not always the case, especially for breaking news.
Also something, which I don't know if this is what the person who asked the question meant by narrative, but in journalism, you don't insert you don't insert yourself into the narrative. The narrative is always going to be an anecdote about somebody else. So I could do an anecdote about Angela missing the tea or something, but I can't say oh, I missed the tea earlier today and it was the worst thing that ever happened. So the only time you really use I, me, my, your own stories is if that's an opinion article, which a lot of what you'll hear, at least from professors of journalism or journalists, is opinion is not real news. So if you have a feature article, if you have anything hard news, feature, sports, whatever it may be, your narrative is not going to be your personal narrative.
And a great way to find those anecdotes is just ask your source. When you're kind of maybe towards the end of the interview, you might ask is there a story you can share or an anecdote that really represents this topic? It depends on what story you're writing, but it's definitely in features. I've done it a lot, and sometimes you'll hear a story and you just know right there, that's my lead.
Also, in terms of,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Also, in terms of writing styles of what exactly should I be doing, what's expected of me, I think just checking out the news outlet that you're writing for and examples in the past is really helpful. This is especially like applicable to freelancing, of like these papers are going to pick up what fits their style. So if you can already acclimate to that, you're far more likely to have your pitch selected. That's sort of on the other side of things, but I think important.
Yeah, so I see we have a question about if you're trying to interview someone and they're only available during a time when you have class, are professors usually okay with letting you do the interviews? So this is something to learn as a student journalist, is that a lot of people that aren't in journalism don't understand journalism. I would say if you're in a journalism class, I'm sure almost always a professor would understand if you need to do an interview that's literally doing journalism. If you're taking a random math or political science class, I personally would not really ask a professor, just because I think they'd say no. They'd be like, this is my class time. So in that case, I would tell your source, like, I'm really sorry, I'm a student, I can only talk at this time. Like, give your blocks, unless there is a chance that you can run out of the class and it won't be a problem. Most cases isn't. Or a good backup, if you have a very limited time frame where someone can do an interview, ask another reporter that you're friends with, ask the editor, say, hey, I'm going to be in class all day, I don't have time to take this interview, can you do it for me? Like, I'll transcribe it, I'll write it up. Just ask for help. But I will say that I don't expect teachers that aren't journalism professors to understand that you're going to miss class for an interview. Journalism professors might understand, some might not, even, because people can be difficult. But yeah, ask for help.
Yeah, definitely. But it's interesting. I had kind of an opposite experience. It really depends on the professor. Like, I had a journalism or like a communications professor who really was not very accommodating when I wanted to interview someone during class, even though it was a 3-hour class. And then I had a really small like writing seminar thing where I asked on the first day of class because I had an interview, and then he was like, actually, yeah, like, I love student journalism, go for it. So it really depends on who your professor is. There's no really general answer. But also, like, if you're in a big lecture, it's really feasible sometimes to just walk outside with your recording device for 15 minutes or so, sit down outside, just do your interview, and then come back in if it's not something that's super essential. Like, obviously, like, don't try to miss class, but it's like their professors are not as strict as you might think they would be. They probably won't even notice if it's a big class. So I think that's all the questions for now. So let's go back to tools for transcribing an interview after it's done. So if you have an hour-long interview, that is going to be an absolute pain to transcribe. That's why writing down timestamps is so important, because you don't necessarily need to transcribe the entire interview. That's kind of a waste of time if you know where the most relevant places are. So go to those spots and transcribe those few minutes in scattered places where you know that you got a really good quote, or you know that you got really good information. And this is the app that I mentioned before that I typed it into the chat, otter.ai. It is super useful. It transcribes things for you, which is great, but it's also nowhere near perfect. So don't just rely on the AI technology. Make sure to check for accuracy in your quotes, because it's really annoying when your editors get quotes that are transcribed by AI, and then it ends up being, it just doesn't make sense because it's not transcribed very well. So use it as a tool, but don't use it as like a perfect transcription device.
Yeah, and I would just say doing transcriptions are probably one of the worst parts of being a journalist, but they're necessary. You get better at them with practice at the speed. What I would do is try to have the recording play on like your computer, like on iTunes or something, in a place that you can easily press pause while typing. So it's really just like a skill thing that you learn, but like you listen to a part, try to type it out. If you can get behind, make it so you can pause easily and you don't have to keep rewinding and missing stuff. And also, like, if you're at a part that you know you're not really going to be quoting from, you just need some facts, like, don't write the full quotes. Just use your judgment. If it's a long interview, if it's a short 5-minute interview, I would say transcribe it all. But if it's long interviews, use your judgment for some parts.
All right. So let's move on to the final slide where we'll talk about your assignment for the week. So basically, hopefully at the end of these 2 weeks, you'll have written a story, and if we select it to be published in the FREEP, then we'll definitely let you know about that. But basically, for this week, find 3 story pitches that you're going to pitch at next week's webinar. So if you want to choose a story that is based in Boston, then you have a good chance of being published in the FREEP. But you could also do a local story in your own town or on your own school campus. So kind of start thinking about what kind of story you want to do, whether it be hard news or a feature story or sports. All of these sections we will talk about in next week's webinar, but just start thinking about it because that's the section editor that you're going to be pitching to. And so throughout this week, I'll be reaching out to you guys, and we'll be kind of offering mentorship if you need any help with anything. So yeah, we'll definitely keep up with you guys via email. And yeah, so that's your assignment. Does anyone have any other questions regarding anything we talked about?
Leave some comments. We'll stay here for a couple more minutes to see if any of you guys have comments. Yeah. And I don't have a question, but if you guys are really interested in obviously finding your 3 story pitches, something that you can do is go on our own website or go on your local website, your college's website, and see like what has already been done a story on. Even in FREEP, we have writers who will pitch stories that we've already written. So it'll help you know not to write the same story that someone's written. And also it can help you with brainstorming and seeing like, oh, I read this article and this angle can be further explored.
Okay, so we have a question that says, can you explain how long a pitch has to be? I don't think there's a set length that we're asking for. You'll be sending them through a Google form. You don't have to have like the full like story idea fleshed out. Like you don't have to have like basically an idea of what the story will look like at the end. If you have an idea for something that could be developed into a story, if you have an idea of something you want to explore, that is a good enough pitch if it is relevant. So I don't think that you have to worry about necessarily a length requirement. And yeah, we'll share the recordings tomorrow. We'll email it out to you guys and we'll put it on the website. There's one question that says, is this just like a volunteering thing or an internship, or it's just a program? I would not say it's an internship. This is the point of this sort of boot camp is to provide a free training session for basically student journalists. So we just hope for it to be an educational experience where we can talk about this industry as young journalists and kind of just connect with each other. So thank you guys for coming, and we'll definitely be reaching out to you guys throughout the week. We'll be offering our mentorship. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And oh yeah, I'll give you guys some time to jot down the emails that are being sent out. Feel free to reach out to us for anything.
And if you ever just want to talk to any of us about our experience being college journalists or anything, reach out. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why we're running this. So yeah, just feel free.
All right. So I think we can end it here. Thank you everyone for being here and staying with us.
Yep. Thank you guys. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Have a nice night.